it. The title of the piece is called "The Most Romantic Spot." And that's pulled from a quote from George Armstrong Custer. "Like all Indian encampments, the ground chosen was a most romantic spot." George Armstrong Custer, My Life on the Plains, 1874. Just past dawn, on a clear, crisp morning in August, I left my parents' ranch on Saw Log Creek and headed west across the plains toward Colorado. Later, the air would turn hot, but for now I left the windows on my Jeep rolled down so I could feel the wind in my face and smell the alfalfa drying in the bottom ground along the Arkansas River. The day before, I had stood in my driveway in Indianapolis trying to explain to my 8-year-old daughter that I was off to visit a couple of Indian villages I had been reading about. "What kind of Indians?" Rhea asked. "Southern Cheyennes." "And are they expecting you?" "Well, not exactly," I said, explaining that these places I had in mind to visit were not actual villages, but rather sites where villages had once stood, and then only briefly, more than 140 years ago. Rhea nodded her head doubtfully. "Will you take some pictures so I can see?" "Of course I will," I said, bending down to kiss her goodbye. I did not add that these places, each less than a half-day's drive from where I grew up, were the sites of Indian massacres. Why? Because I was too lazy and pressed for time? Maybe. But then again, the massacres themselves could not account for my desire to visit the places in question, for despite all of the reading I had done that summer, much of it in dry tomes of military history, I had no particular interest in lines of attack or defense, lists of the dead and wounded, or even warring accounts of what really happened. Instead, I just wanted to stand where the events themselves had taken place. I wanted to see what the Indians had seen in those places. I wanted, if possible, to imagine them there in that landscape I had known my whole life, because, as much as I hated to admit it, part of me did not quite believe that there had ever been Indians in Kansas. After all, it was not as though the Southern Cheyennes or Kiowas or any of the other Plains tribes had left actual ruins behind. They were nomads. As the novelist Thomas McGuane once quipped, it would take a shovel to know they had been there at all. Part 1, Sand Creek. To anyone even vaguely familiar with Western history, Sand Creek stands out as a blight and a scar. It was there on November 29, 1864, that Colonel John M. Chivington, a Methodist minister turned Indian fighter and would-be politician, led a group of 700 mostly untrained volunteers in a dawn attack on a peaceful Cheyenne village. With the Civil War still raging in the East, and rumors of Indian complicity with the Confederacy rife throughout the West, the citizens of Denver feared that if they did not strike the Indians first, the Indians would surely strike them. And so, Colonel Chivington and his men rode in with their rifles and cannon, and a terrible calamity ensued. Somewhere between 130 and 160 Indians died that day, most of them women and children, who dug pits in the walls of the creek in a desperate bid to stay alive. As if this weren't bad enough, when the fighting ceased, around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Chivington's men proceeded to scalp the dead and hack their bodies to pieces. And the trophies they took away from this gruesome business were later displayed to applause before a Denver theater. Coming north from Lamar, then right on Colorado Highway 96, I soon made the town of Chivington, founded in 1887 when the railroad came through. Most of the dozen or so buildings I saw there were vacant or in the process of falling in on themselves. The lone exception was a Quaker church bearing the name Friends of Chivington. As I considered the manifold ironies of this name, the rear right tire on the Jeep blew out and I wobbled to a stop by the roadside. In the 20 minutes it took me to change the tire, not a single car or truck passed by. It was just me and the prairie dogs and the wind and the heat. This is not a good omen, I thought. The tire changed. I turned off the highway onto a sand road made slippery by recent rain. 8 miles later, the road came to a T I saw depicted on my 6-year-old Rand McNally. From here, I could see a line of cottonwoods snaking down from the west. I turned right and kept going. The land stretched away for miles. Nothing but sagebrush and sand hills with a few head of cattle grazing here and there. Then, a mile past the T, I came to a ranch road that was heavily gated and locked, with not one but 2 no trespassing signs adorning it. I got out of the Jeep and stood before the locked gate with its oddly officious signs. There could be no question that the rutted lane on the other side of that gate was the road to Sand Creek. Perhaps a mile beyond the gate, the land rose into a series of high bluffs I recognized from pictures I had seen of the massacre site. Leaving Kansas that morning, I had imagined myself standing atop these very bluffs looking down into the creek below, which I knew to be wide and dry and lined with tall cottonwoods. All I had to do now to make that dream come true was to step over a steel gate and begin walking. 10 minutes later, I'd be there. And yet I hesitated, unable to take a single step. Why? The act of trespassing on remote rangeland is a common enough occurrence in the West, and it was not as though I were there to commit the sort of heinous crimes Shivington and his men had. Still, I couldn't bring myself to do it. Somehow I just didn't feel welcome or justified, and so I settled for snapping a half-dozen pictures as I drove in a kind of box route around the site of the massacre. Shaking my head ruefully, I cast a final look at those bluffs, made a promise to myself, and headed back down the road to Kansas. Part 2, Washita. The next morning, I started south on Highway 283, headed for the Washita Battlefield National Historic Site near Cheyenne, Oklahoma. There, on a frigid morning in November 1868, almost exactly 4 years to the day after the massacre at Sand Creek, George Armstrong Custer led the 7th Cavalry in a dawn attack on the sleeping village of the Cheyenne chief Black Kettle, whose small band had borne the brunt at Sand Creek as well. Has there ever been an Indian more gullible and unlucky than Black Kettle? Each time he appears in the histories, he's in the middle of some improbable speech about how his people have nothing to fear from the white man. Yet no sooner is the speech delivered than a bugle blares in the distance and the aforementioned white man arrives amid a barrage of rifle and cannon fire. So it was at Sand Creek, where Black Kettle famously raised a large American flag over his lodge, a flag he had been given at a peace council in 1860, only to see those of his people who sought shelter beneath the flag slaughtered before his eyes. And so it was at Washita, too, only on this occasion, neither Black Kettle nor Medicine Woman later, his wife, who was shot 9 times at Sand Creek, managed to escape. In My Life on the Plains, which remains in print even today, Custer paints a heroic picture of the 7th Cavalry battling through deep snow in order to achieve what the general terms a great and important success over the hostile tribes. Custer's account is thorough, and he does not spare the gory details. But insofar as they remember it at all, contemporary Americans know a very different version. That's supplied by Thomas Berger in his 1964 novel, Little Big Man, wherein Jack Crabb, later played by Dustin Hoffman, and his blind Cheyenne grandfather, Old Lodgeskins, walk unharmed through the whole of Custer's army, even as bullets